Thank you all so much for coming out on this very gloomy evening. It's great to see you all out here. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the conversation tonight, Heather will be signing and personalizing books at the desk behind me near the side entrance. And of course, we have additional books available for purchase tonight. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Butts online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so with all that in mind, we are very excited to introduce Heather Radke and Adrienne Westenfeld, who are here celebrating the release of Heather's debut launch, Butts, A Backstory. But we find an incredible combination of investigative journalism, personal reflection, and answers to questions never before thought of. Well-rounded and ample in size and sources, this book is a fascinating read from start to finish. Heather Radke is an essayist, journalist, and contributing editor and reporter at Radiolab, the Peabody Award-winning program from WNYC. She has written for publications including The Believer, Long Reads, and the Paris Review, and she teaches at Columbia University's Creative Writing MFA program. As I mentioned before, Adrienne Westenfeld joins Heather in conversation tonight. Adrienne is the books and fiction editor at Esquire, where she oversees books coverage, curates the Esquire Book Club, and edits fiction. Her work has appeared in Esquire, Town and Country, and Elle, among other places. All right, that's all for me. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Heather and Adrienne.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here with us tonight, and hi folks at home, thank you for coming to see us. We're going to start with a short reading from Heather.
Oh, okay. But first I should just say, thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and it's, so many people in this room have been such an integral part of making this book possible in any number of ways, and it means so much to me to have all of you here and to have people from so many different parts of my life, and thank you so much to Adrienne for doing this, and to Books Are Magic, and especially to Juliana, my editor, and Jordan, my publicist, and my other publicist, Alex, who's not here. They've all just been a huge part of how this book has been successful, so I really appreciate all of them and so many others here. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning. The first butt I remember isn't my own. It's my mother's. At 7 years old, I would sit on the fluffy toilet seat cover in my parents' bathroom and watch her get ready for the day, standing in front of the mirror in her bra and underwear, smearing lotion onto her body. She rolled Velcro curlers into her short brown hair, a few girthy pink ones on top, several smaller green ones on the sides. She cracked the window to let out the steam of the shower, and the Michigan morning air, cold and thin, woke me up. Close your eyes, she told me, and as I did, she liberally doused her hair with hairspray. I held my breath, fearing the sticky choke. Then she took her glasses off and leaned in close to the mirror and curled her lashes, her butt sticking out as she leaned over the counter. As a young girl, my mom's was the only naked adult body I'd ever seen. I imagined all women's bodies looked like hers, shapely and short, with full breasts and an ample butt that filled out any pair of pants. I liked the idea that one day my body would look the same, a fate that seemed as inevitable as growing taller or getting my period. She was beautiful and free as she went about her morning ablutions. The clear-sightedness of childhood allowed me to see my mother's butt for what it actually was, a body part like anything else, like any other, something to love because I loved the human it was part of. It was not a problem or a blessing, it was only a fact. What I did not know then is that butts are not so simple. They are not like elbows or knees, functional body parts that carry few associations beyond their physiological function. Instead, butts, silly as they may often seem, are tremendously complex symbols, fraught with significance and nuance, laden with humor and sex, shame and history. Women's butts have been used as a means to create and enforce racial hierarchies, as a barometer for the virtues of hard work, and as a measure of sexual desire and availability. Despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that there is little a person can do to dramatically change the way their butt looks without surgical intervention, the shape and size of a woman's butt has long been a perceived indicator of her very nature, her morality, her femininity, and even her humanity. But butts can be very hard to see clearly. The fact that they are on our backside mean that they are somewhat alien to us, even as they are perfectly visible to others. To see your butt, you need the cocoon of mirrors of a dressing room, the cumbersome triangulation of a hand mirror in a bedroom, or an awkwardly held smartphone. And when you catch sight of your butt, or at least when I catch sight of my butt, there's always a bit of surprise. That's what's trailing me? There's a note of humiliation in this. We don't ever really know what someone else is seeing when they're looking at our butts, which can make us vulnerable. There's also a giving over. In some ways, the butt belongs to the viewer more than the viewed. It can be observed secretly, ogled in private, creepily scrutinized. In order to know how a pair of pants fits, I must ask a salesperson how my butt looks, because I cannot see for myself. A woman passes a man on the street, and then his head turns to look at her butt. Although everyone else on the street may spot the greedy glance, the woman may not, and doesn't realize she is being assessed, criticized, objectified, desired.
That was so great. Thank you so much. So take me back to the beginning of this book. When and how did you decide that you were going to write a microhistory of butts?
Well, I feel like there's so many ways to answer that question. I think when it started to become a book was when I was getting an MFA at Columbia with like many of the people in this room, and I was working on a couple of different essays about bodies and shame, and I was really interested in a really particular kind of bodily shame, which is not something big and grand, but actually just something very, in some senses, normal, like the ways that we all feel about our bodies when we just put on our clothes in the morning, or the ways that you might feel in a dressing room. And I was interested in essentially mundane shame. And the story that kind of always echoed for me, that spoke to that kind of specific thread of a feeling, was when I was in high school, this girl, I was just talking on a text thread with my high school friends, and they're like, man, I wonder if that girl's gonna read this book. She really like launched 1,000 ships, didn't she? There was like this girl at a cross country practice who had sort of made a comment to a bunch of other girls about me having a big butt, and like several days later I was with this other person who was like, oh, this girl said this mean thing about you. And and it's like, you know, that's just like a thing teenage girls do. It's mean, but it's also just like, you know, who amongst us hasn't, right? And so that story sort of became when I was interested in this feeling of mundane shame, I was like, right, the thing I've always felt like a little bit bad about is my butt. And then I started to want to investigate why butts have the meanings that they have. And once I started to kind of go down that road, I just realized how vast and complex the meanings are about butts, and how many different kind of parts of life and history it touched.
That term mundane shame, it's so personal. And I love that the book opens with the personal, because it's a book about science, culture, history, memoir, all of that is there. But at the same time, this is such a universal experience, these feelings. And I understand that at one point during the drafting process, you surveyed people about their feelings about their butts. There are so many different anecdotes in the book, but I'm curious, what did all of those conversations reveal to you? Were there any through lines?
Yeah, I mean, I that was something that was really important to me. I felt like it was, you know, you can only know how you feel about your body unless you talk to other people about it, and there's just so many different ways to live in a body and so many different kinds of bodies. So the only way I could figure that out was I did written surveys, and then I did long oral histories with people. And I mean, certainly there's all kinds of ways people feel about their butts. Some people love their butts, some people hate them, some people want them bigger, some people want them smaller. I think that maybe the most universal thing I found was the feeling of clothes not fitting, actually. The feeling of being in a dressing room and not being able to find a pair of pants that fit.
It's true. It's true. I never meet anyone who's like, "Oh yeah, I had a great day pants shopping."
Yeah, I mean, I've met one person, and she's the person in the book who all the pants fit. That's her job, is to make them fit her body. So that lady has a good job and good time clothes shopping.
That is something that was one of the most revelatory things about the book for me, the chapter about the garment industry and how broken it is. As you write, clothing designers and manufacturers don't actually expect their garments to fit. Can you summarize what people might not know about the clothing industry and how it affects our perceptions of our bodies?
Yeah, I mean, it was something that I think it maybe shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, because I think that the feeling that I have and a lot of people have when you go and try on clothes is like, there's something wrong with my body that these clothes don't fit my body. But actually what's going on is that there's something inherently wrong with not just that specific piece of clothes, but with clothes in general. Like, clothes are a mass manufactured thing. They're made like a car is made, right? Like, so it's like every pair of pants is exactly the same, but every single one of our bodies is particular and different, and there's just no way that those two realities can come together in a way that make clothes fit. So there's a long history of the garment industry trying to make clothes fit. It works pretty well for men, works way less well for women. And that's basically because women have bulges on their bodies that men don't have. And yeah, it's just, I mean, as my friend Abigail, who I interviewed like 5 times, because I kept calling her back to be like, but wait, how can this possibly be a business model that like there's nobody whose clothes ever fit them? She was just like, yeah, I mean, it's not as sinister as you might think. Like, it's not like they are in a tower twirling their mustache trying to make you feel bad about your body, but it's just not actually possible to make clothes fit the wide variety of humans at cost and without it costing like a massive amount of money.
I took down one of the quotes from Abigail because I loved it so much. She told you have to remember your clothes have nothing to do with your body. Clothes are a series of questions related to the bottom line, not the correctness of the product.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and it's absolutely true. And I think that is actually kind of a liberating thing to think about when you go into a dressing room, is to just remember that they're not actually supposed to fit you. Like, it's a shame, it's too bad. Like, it'd be nice if our clothes fit, but that's not not the game we're playing. Yeah, exactly.
On this front of fashion, you take it all the way back to, not the modern dressing room, but women getting dressed with corsets and bustles a long time ago. And from there, we moved to the early 20th century, where we saw they invented the bathroom scale and plastic surgery and the fat diet. And the question became not, how can you alter your body through clothes, but how can you alter your body itself? And I think that brings us up to the present, where we're now seeing these viral TikToks of women. Have you seen this being carted home from their Brazilian butt lifts?
No.
Oh, it's crazy. Women flying home on their fronts because they can't sit down.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the Brazilian butt lift has become a fad. I mean, so many women are getting this surgery. How is it connected to this long history of women striving to change their shape through clothes or through more sinister means?
I mean, right. So the Brazilian butt lift is, it's one of the most popular cosmetic surgery procedures. It has been for about 15 years. Before that, it was almost unknown in the U.S. And yeah, I mean, as far as it being like a part of a long line of ways that women change their bodies, I mean, certainly that's true. Like, as you say, in the 19th century, women primarily used essentially different kinds of underwear to change their bodies, so corsets and bustles and petticoats. And then there's this shift in the 20s, and there's a well-known fashion writer and thinker named Valerie Steele who posits that instead of the corset being outside the body, it comes inside the body, and it becomes the woman's job to control herself the way that the corset was controlling women in the 19th century. And I mean, then ever since then, we have the fashion industry getting bigger and bigger, and it's essentially a motive. This changing of body ideal from, you should have big shoulders in the 80s, or you should look like Kate Moss in 1992, to, you know, the rise of the kind of large butt as beauty ideal. Like this, there's lots of reasons why that happens, but one of the things that's happening is it's a mode of control from the fashion industry. And it's a truly bizarre thing if you think about it, that like a body and a body part can come in and out of fashion. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense because it's like a part of, you can't, it's not actually that easy to change your body unless you have plastic surgery. So, and that's a very extreme thing to do.
Well, some people can change it. Look at the Kardashians. I want to ask you about this. There's all this speculation that they have removed their BBLs. And there was this moment earlier this year where Kim Kardashian broke the internet with her Marilyn Monroe dress that she wore because she slimmed down overnight seemingly to wear this dress. What does that signify to you when women can treat their butts like an accessory almost to take on and off?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this was something that I saw so much throughout the history of the butt, was that especially white women have, I mean, it's, I think you can sort of see it most clearly and most obviously with the bustle, which is a, I mean, just in case you aren't familiar, it's like a garment that's essentially like a giant fake butt that women in the 19th century, they would tie around their waist, and it was like, you know, sometimes it was made of springs or it was made of cushions. And there had long been this idea that you can sort of see threaded through different types of historical and contemporary sources, that the bustle was it existed for a lot of different reasons. It's a really weird fashion, but one idea was that it was an echo of the body of this woman named Sarah Bartman, who had been brought up from South Africa in the early 19th century to be displayed as a freak show in London because she had a big butt, and then was, after her death, she was, this famous French scientist, Georges Cuvier, did an autopsy, and then that autopsy report was used throughout the 19th and early 20th century as a way to, like, quote unquote, you know, give proof that people from Africa were less human than people from Europe, and that black women were more hypersexual than white women. So that, all of that history is like then sort of put onto this certain type of body that then is kind of recreated with the bustle. So it's like a long walk, I guess, of a story, but I'm getting to the answer to your question. So it's like, in the 19th century, middle class, upper class white women are putting on this garment that essentially makes their bodies look like Sarah Bartman, and it's this kind of unusual but very, I think, quite clear moment of cultural appropriation. And really what they're doing is they're able to both put it on and then take it off. And I think that it's both of those gestures, right? It's the putting on and the taking it off, where we see the power and privilege of whiteness and the construction of race that's happening in those moments. And then, you know, you can really start to see that echoing throughout the 20th century and then into the last 15 years really openly. And in a, you know, maybe Miley Cyrus is the most obvious example with her 2013 twerk explosion. But with Kim Kardashian too, I mean, that's like in this moment where it's like, is she taking out her BBL? Is she like getting thin? Like the prerogative of like having gotten so much money, so much fame from being adjacent to this stereotype of black femininity, which is always kind of putting forward, and then now she's gonna like essentially take off her bustle and get whatever privilege she wants from that. So I think it's, you know, to some extent it doesn't even matter if it's true if she's taking it on or off or whatever, but the fact that that's how it seems and that she's sort of able to do it, I think really speaks very much to both the history of the butt and the way that bodies can be controlled.
It's interesting that you mentioned Sarah Bartman. That was, you open the book with information about her, and she kind of recurs throughout the book, and she had this brief, brutal life. Did she die at 26?
I think so. It's
Okay.
a little hard to know because it's hard to know when she was born exactly. Yeah.
So much of her story and the way she was treated is quite shocking. I'm curious, what about her story most surprised or shocked you in all the research you did about her?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a history I knew a little bit about, but then, you know, I read all the histories I could find and did as much archival research as I could and talked to a bunch of scholars about it. I think, although this was something I knew all along, when I went to Paris and I looked at the museums where her body had been displayed, I think the thing that's undoubtedly most shocking about her story whenever I hear it is that her body, so after the dissection and the autopsy, Georges Cuvier put her body parts on display in his museum in Paris, and they were on display in Paris until the 1980s, which is just a tremendously long time. And they actually then went back on display in the 90s. And I mean, that's like in most of our lifetime. So I think one of the things about that is just so important to remember is like that history can seem so long ago, and it can just sort of seem like, you know, whatever horror show we're living in now, like we're not doing that, but that's actually like not really true. Like that, you know, the fact that her body was on display in that way, in like a very kind of grotesque way in these Paris museums so recently, I think is really shocking. And then, you know, I think it's also important to remember that like, and then what happened to those body parts was that South African activists advocated in the post-apartheid era to have them repatriated to South Africa, and then it was her body, her remains were buried in South Africa, and there's like actually a very rich history of what that has meant in South Africa. So it's like a legacy that continues, and like also there's some repair in it too, and I think it's important to remember that like there's also a lot of people who are trying to think about the ways to grapple with that legacy. Yeah.
Don't you write as well that it took 6 years to negotiate the return of her remains? I mean, it's crazy not just that this was happening in the 1990s, but that France was so resistant that it took that long.
France was very resistant to returning them. I mean, it's which is actually not that uncommon. I mean, that's still true with a lot of human remains in museums. Is the repatriation of a lot of objects is it's actually very unusual that they're sent back even now. And I don't know, I mean, it was also that Georges Cuvier is like a very important French scientist, and they really didn't, like the French Congress, who was gonna have to sign off on it, didn't want to like sully his legacy or something, but then ultimately they did. But yeah, it was, I don't know, it was just it was really, that part of it is pretty shocking too, because it's all really recent, yeah.
So the Kardashians can use plastic surgery to change their shape, but for many people that you write about in the book, the only remedy is exercise. And you take us through Buns of Steel, Jane Fonda's workout tapes, the fat fitness movement of the 1980s. Is there any form of exercise today that kind of occupies that butt-obsessed space? Is anyone carrying that tradition on?
Man, I think you asked me this when we talked before, and I still feel like I don't know, because I think that the truth is like I'm like a historical person. So even though this is like a very like trendy, hot topic, I'm still like, cool, can we talk about like 1920? Can we like, talk about hot fitness trends and like the early 20th century?
It's so funny, I can see how a project like this would expose what you don't know about the present. Maybe
like
you're not on TikTok.
I don't know. It's like, I don't know, even like after 2017, I'm like, I really can't speak to a lot of it, but so I think the answer is I don't know. I'm sure there is, although I do think like, at least as far as I can tell, it seems like we're kind of in a shifting moment about what butts are and what they mean. I think in 2014 there was a lot of, which is like like whatever Vogue and the New York Times and all these places called the Year of the Butt. There was a lot of different kinds of exercise classes that were promising bigger butts. I mean, kind of what I think is interesting and weird about that is like, if you look at, like, I looked at so many fashion magazines and so many tabloid magazines, which are actually like interestingly hard to access. Like somebody out there should like.
That's your next book.
Make a cool, I know, I'm always like trying to pitch this at Radio Lab. Nobody actually wants to hear the story, but I'm just gonna say right now, which is like somebody should like find all the tabloids from the 90s and also like get all the episodes of Sally Jesse Raphael and like make them available to researchers. Because it's actually so important. But like until the early 2010s, most kind of mainstream white fashion magazines and tabloids, they don't really, I mean, really it happens in 97, like everyone's trying to get you to have a small butt until all of a sudden they're trying to get you to have a bigger butt, but it's like the exercises are all weirdly the same exercises, so you can just sort of see the way it's all kind of a sham.
And as the consumer, that gives you such whiplash, and also such self-doubt for women. I mean, what are you supposed to be? It changes week to week.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of serious stuff and serious ideas here, and there certainly is that in the book about race and appropriation and science, but I love how the book never forgets that butts can often be site of humor. And I don't want to lose sight of that. Butts can be funny, and it's healthy to laugh about our bodies sometimes. What did you learn in the course of all this research that amused you or delighted you?
Oh man. I did have a lot of fun with the 80s fitness section. I mean, I interviewed Greg Smithy, who made Buns of Steel, and he's just like almost like exactly what you want him to be. Like I talked to him for like 3 or 4 days straight. My fact checker, who I'm not sure could get in tonight, but she also talked to him for 3 or 4 days straight. And he's just like a real character, you know. He like claimed to train Sarah Palin, and he like what was it, like he was really adamant that he was the white boy in the song Play That Funky Music. And then me and my fact checker like really tried to figure out if he was. He was not.
So did you call him out?
No, actually it was like way after the fact, so I was just like, I put it in the book where I was like, he claimed that and he wasn't, because I think it just, meeting people like that is like such a pleasure of a certain kind of reporting where it's just like, you know, what a wild, weird world we're in. Like, that this guy was like, he just like was an entrepreneur. He wanted to like make it big in the 80s. And he also like, his story really mapped onto something about the 80s, which was like, it was like neoliberal heyday. Like we're like making our bodies look the way that we want them to look is a sign of success. It's like a sign of self-control. It's such an important thing. And like Greg Smithy was trying to like be a self-made man, and he took these crazy seminars with this guy Ziglar, which I had not heard of, but he's like a big guy in the 80s. Like it was just like a really, it was a good story that really seemed like it mapped onto some of the bigger themes of the time too. Yeah.
What might a version of this book about men's butts have in store? Something I was thinking about is how in the ancient world having a quote-unquote good butt was associated with men. And Are there other interesting data points in the sphere of men's butts?
A classicist told me that really recently, because I went to the Met with the reporter recently, and I was like, I knew we were gonna look at classical statuary, but classical statuary is mostly men, and yes, in the ancient world, their men's butts were kind of the thing, and like I hadn't heard this until this very smart person told me, but she was like, the Venus callipygian, which is like the Venus with the nice butt, is what that, I guess that meant was like, she had a nice butt. Like it was sort of like, she was like, it's sort of like being like, my girlfriend also likes sports. Like it's like her, and it was like hot in a way that like had echoes of a good man's butt. So it was just like so different than how we think about it now. But as far as like what a book about men's butts would be about, I think it would be a lot about homosexuality, about like the various like different symbolism of maleness, and I don't know, I'd have to, I mean, it was a decision I made so early on, like sometimes it would kind of come into the frame, but I think it would definitely include, the classic world. I think lots of questions about gender and gender identity and sexuality, and I don't know, and I guess maybe pant size. Like, when I talked to Latif at Radiolab about the sizing thing, he told me all about men's sizing, which I did know something about, but it is really different than women's sizing. So I guess the military would come into it quite a bit. Yeah.
They have it so nice in the men's section.
It's just measurements.
What a concept.
Yeah.
We're gonna open it up to questions here really soon, but I have one last one before we get to you. Walking away from the book, what's the one thing you wish we could all understand about butts, or perhaps understand differently?
I think that this idea that like they don't have to mean anything, but we've made them mean so much. That felt like when I talked to the scientists and I really realized how little they actually mean anything. Like it's just like muscle and fat, and even like there's a lot of people have ideas about like evolutionary psychology and how, you know, a big butt means you're more fertile or whatever, and like all of that is basically not true, and it's all just like another symptom of the way that we've used ideas about gender and race that are 200 and 300 years old, and kind of like piled them on top of the butt. And I think that's kind of important because I think it helps us to realized that like there's a lot of things we're doing with bodies that are about turning them into metaphors and, you know, having unconscious ideas kind of filter into how we basically decide who's better and who's worse and whose bodies are better and who's worse, and that there's you know, it's hard to unwind those histories and those metaphors, but it's probably a project worth doing because there's just a lot of pain in the associations and symbols that we put onto our bodies.
And there is some movement toward that, right? There are people pushing for body neutrality and wanting to explore that idea more.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that's like really important activism work that people are doing. And I think it's also just like really hard because, you know, when you grow up in you're steeped in a culture that has associations about bodies that you're never gonna like undo it. But I think to bring something that's unconscious to the conscious is always a useful project.
I think you've given us some help with this book, though. People are going to go to the dressing room and say, it's not me, it's the clothes.
That's right.
That's right. So does anyone out here have any questions they'd like to ask? Just raise your hand. Yeah, you're right there.
Neolithic figurines like the Venus of Willendorf are often assumed or dubbed fertility figurines because of the large breasts and hips. And I was wondering if, in your research, you came across those archaeological interpretations as a product sort of that same type of bustle type thinking, or if you're finding that any historians or archaeologists are trying to reimagine what those types of figurines may have actually represented. Maybe they could have been just a depiction of somebody, for all we know, as they looked.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I haven't done a ton of research about it, but I recently looked into it just like surface level, and I think you're right. Like they're always assumed to be fertility statues, or I mean, yeah, basically there's a lot of assumptions made about what they are that come from when they were found, like you're saying, and also like what the person looking at them. And this is, I think, very true about a lot of very old things. Like you see this with like all this evolutionary psychology, you see it a lot, like you see it like in a lot of discussion of like ancient man or early hominids or whatever. It's like this desire to put our contemporary ideas onto the past, the deep past. I think it's a really important thing to unpack. And as far as I know, those figurines, people actually just don't know what they are. Like they could be fertility gods, they could just be like somebody's, like I carved a thing of my mom, they could be like pornographic depictions, they could be any number of things, and it might be the kind of thing like we will never know, because it's also a lot of the culture around them is, at least so far, we haven't found it. But it was something I found really interesting about looking at those super old human things. One of the things I really liked that I found is like muscle leaves a mark on the fossil record, but fat doesn't, and no soft tissue does. So like beards don't, and like penises don't, and breasts don't. So we actually like don't know all these things about what ancient man looked like. But you will always see it when you see them drawn. They're always like thin, lithe, like sort of white seeming. Like it's just like, but all of that, like we don't know. We actually have no idea. They could be like, none of them had beards, or they all had beards, or whatever. You know, like they didn't have long hair. Like we just have no idea. And I think it's like that not knowing is a really important thing to embrace when you're talking about really old stuff like that.
Thank you. That's a great question. Anyone else? Don't be shy, Heather and I shouldn't have all the fun. Well, if you're eager to get to the back and have books signed, we can break for that part. So thank you so much for coming to see us, everyone, and thank you, Adrienne.
As I mentioned earlier, Heather is going to be personalizing and signing books at the back desk behind me. We'll have sticky notes available for personalizations as well. So we ask that you do make your way downstairs so we can start clearing up the area, but just give Heather a minute to get settled before you approach her. Otherwise, we've got plenty of additional books available for purchase at the front. They make fantastic presents, and that's all. Let's give Heather and Adrienne one last round.